Welcome to Conversations, Lehman College's series of discussions with major theater figures of our time. Our guest today, for the first of a two-part chat, is one of America's most gifted and appreciated stage directors, my old friend, Marshall W. Mason. Welcome to the show, Marsha.
Thank you, Bill. I won't ask you to define old friend, but
we've been around for a while.
Yeah.
For those who are not familiar with your work, and I wanted to mention that you have directed 12 shows on Broadway, many of them earning Tony Awards, and you yourself have been nominated 5 times for a Tony for Best Director, Knock Knock, Talley's Follies, 5th of July, Angels Falls, and our own As Is, of which I'm the author. Off-Broadway, you have directed, you have received 5 Obie Awards for Best Director, and you received the 6th Obie for Lifetime Achievement. You're an extraordinary director. I can vouch for that, having worked with you. You're also the founding artistic director of Circle Rep, which, in my opinion, is the heir to the Moscow Art Theater. I don't think I'm exaggerating. That was a golden moment in American theater, and I miss it terribly. The Circle Rep introduced, brought to America such playwrights as Lanford Wilson, Sam Shepard, David Mamet, myself, John Robin Baitz, Craig Lucas, an incredible series of actors, including Bill Hurt. It just goes on and on. Christopher Reeve, Jeff Daniels, Farley Granger, Brad Dourif, Lindsay Krause, Judd Hirsch, Deborah Monk. Some nights I turn on Law and Order and I think it's old days at Circle Rep. Your influence on the theater is enormous, and certainly your influence on me is enormous. Where were you born?
I was born in Amarillo, Texas, but I didn't live there long. About my 6th year or so, I moved down to a small town in South Texas near Austin called Luling, L-U-L-I-N-G. And I grew up for most of my young adolescent years there until I got to an age where I really realized that this Amarillo as a city had more to offer me. And so I moved back there my sophomore year to graduate high school from Amarillo High as well. I was born there and graduated high school there, but grew up in South Texas in a small town.
Now, a kid from South Texas is not going to have that much acquaintance with the theater. Wouldn't such a kid have to?
No,
How did you get involved in theater?
It was the movies, Bill. Every Saturday afternoon I would go to see what was usually a double feature at the Stanley Theater. And I think the big influence in my life was probably seeing a movie called Pinky, directed by Elia Kazan, and I knew that something extraordinary. It was about a black woman passing for white in the South. It was a very interesting and awakening film for me, and I realized that it was something more profound than anything else I was seeing. So I stayed around till the credits rolled past a second time, and it said, directed by Elia Kazan, and I said, oh, he's the one who's somehow responsible for why this movie is so good. So I went to school the next day. I was 8 or 10 years old, and told everyone who would listen, oh, Elia Kazan is my favorite director, having no idea what a director was, of course, but I knew that he was the best. So I've grown up really with Kazan as my artistic hero, and I've tried to emulate the kind of work that he did.
How did you get, well, I met you in New York at the Caffe Cino, which
Yes.
we'll get to. How did you get to New York? Well, I'm
From
dimly
Texas.
aware that you were in Chicago, et cetera. What is this route? How did you get there?
Yeah, well, you know, you asked about how did I become acquainted with the theater. Outside of movies, when I was in high school, in Amarillo High School, I would go to the library, the high school library, and I would read the Best Plays Annual, which religiously. And so all of my acquaintance with the theater really came from the Best Plays Annual, the Otis Guernsey, I think it was John Chapman originally, and then later Otis Guernsey and eventually Jeff Sweet. And I read those plays in encapsulated form. And that's how I first knew about Tennessee Williams and read, you know, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in an abridged version. Glass Menagerie, all those, Death of a Salesman, all those plays first came to me, be meaningful to me in the high school library. And when I was just about to graduate from high school, one of my best friends, Gary Tesler, came driving by and he said, well, where are you going to school? And I said, I guess the University of Texas. Where are you going? And he said, oh, I'm going to Northwestern, which is the best school in the country for theater. And I had never heard of Northwestern, so I went in the next day and spoke to my high school advisor, a woman named Jane Whitworth. And I said to Miss Whitworth, do you know anything about Northwestern University? Because I would really be interested in finding out more. She said, I'm a graduate of Northwestern. And so she gave me brochures and I applied. And I went to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where I studied with the great legendary Alvina Krauss, who was the greatest teacher of acting of our time. And I had a great class. I was there in a real golden era. Everybody in my class became famous. I was the last on my the last on the block because in my class were Paula Prentice, Richard Benjamin, Karen Black, Larry Pressman, Tony Roberts.
Oh my God!
It was a remarkable class, and we had a great time together, all of us. And Stuart Hagman, the Hollywood director.
Right.
Yeah. So when I finished Northwestern in 1961, I moved directly to New York and went. The first weekend I was here, a friend of mine from Northwestern, Jane Lowry, was appearing in a play downtown.
Of course.
Said, oh, come see me in this play. Where is it? The Caffe Cino on Cornelia Street. So I found my way to Greenwich Village and saw the second play, I believe, the second original play, which was by Doric Wilson, and it was called Now She Dances. And
Starred Jane Lowry.
Starring Jane Lowry. And it was a story of how Salome should have been written if Oscar Wilde had written it the way he wrote all of his other plays. So the head of John the Baptist was in a tea cozy, and the maid was, you know, it was all very, the importance of being earnest, done only the Salome story.
So I must have met you just about that time, and I thought we would, our old days at the Caffe Cino and Off-Off Broadway have been the subject now of, I think, count them 5 books. And I expect any day to see a major motion picture on our youth. And I thought we would, in a moment, I'm going to ask him to roll a clip from Robert Patrick's play, Kennedy's Children, which has a depiction of the Caffe Cino. He calls it Cafe Buffo or something like that. But I remember that place. That's where I got my start. And I never would have written had it not been for Joe Chino. It was a little place on Cornelia Street in the village, and a little hole in the wall is what it amounted to. And I thought we would show that clip from Kennedy's Children, which you directed for, it was for television,
For
wasn't it?
CBS cable, for the very short-lived
Yes.
CBS cable, yeah.
Well, why don't you roll it, Jerry?
The truth is, I used to know a place that was better. There was a little hole in the wall, West Village coffee house called the Opera Buffo. We did plays. We made a living by peddling coffee and pastries and sandwiches. And twice a night we did plays. without worrying about whether we were going to be a hit or get a review or become a star or make it to Broadway or get a grant or anything else except whether we wanted to do it. We got away with it by calling it a coffee house, but what it was a temple. I was 16 and I was bleeding. I was naked from the waist down. 3 sailors had picked me up on the New Jersey Turnpike, and when they found out I wasn't a real girl, they got tough. I was a mixed-up kid. They mixed me up a little more. I don't think I could ever have gotten up if I hadn't heard this music. Opera it was. I was shaken and sick. My lower lip was torn. I was covered with blood. And at first, I thought I was hearing offstage death music like some Tennessee Williams character, and I wanted to get up and run for it. But first, I had to get up. And I fell against the doors, and the doors fell open. And then these shadowy figures at the rear of this empty, insane coffee house stood up and started towards me. And there were all these little flickering little ice cream lights everywhere, and the walls were layers deep in magazine pages and movie posters and classical reproductions. And the people were dressed like a circus clown, and one like something out of the Hitler Youth movement with this glittering necklace of swastikas, and another like a Roman gypsy, and I thought I'd flipped.
You have a new book coming out called
Yes,
Creating Life on Stage. Do you talk about those days in the book?
I do. As a matter of fact, I feature a picture of you and Robert Patrick together in a play that you may recall called The Haunted Hosts, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, but...
well, we might as well show, since we're on the subject, why don't you roll those pictures and we'll talk about it. I remember those days with enormous fondness because it's the youth in the theater. What do you remember?
Well, you know, looking at the clip from Kennedy's Children, you know, this was Robert Patrick's version of the Cino.
Right.
And one of the reasons I wanted to direct it for television was that I had a slightly different memory of it. For me, it was much more magical, I think, than it was for Bob. And so I wanted to bring a visual life to the production that counteracted, in a way, Robert's kind of severe view of it, because as you will remember, Joe Cino, who was our great friend and inspiration, committed suicide, and in the long run, and that, of course, ultimately colored, I think, Bob's take on the Cino very much. And
right.
Whereas for me, I remember all the wonderful, extraordinary things of working with, you know, playwrights and wonderful actors, Bob Heide and David Starkweather and
primarily, of course,
John Guare, you know, Paul Foster, Sam Shepard, Lanford Wilson.
You became associated with and began to work in this wonderful symbiotic relationship with Lanford Wilson. How did you first meet Lanford?
I met Lanford at the Caffe Cino. I had seen 3 of his productions, but I had not bothered to introduce myself. I'd been at the Cino earlier with Clarice Nelson. She and I had, we had the first play that was ever reviewed Off-Off Broadway by Michael Smith. He came to see a production called The Rue Garden and wrote about it.
Of course, yeah.
And Robert Patrick, of course, said, "Oh, that was the beginning of the end," you know, as soon as we had a review. I after seeing Home Free, the revived production of it, I went to Joe Cino to say how wonderful I thought it was, and he said, "Have you told Lanford?" And I said, "I've never met Lanford." He said, "Oh, come over here, let me introduce you." So he took me over to the table where this skinny guy with this long floppy hair and these blue eyes that stood out about a foot in front of his face most alarming eyes you ever saw. And Joe introduced us, and we got off to a very bad start because he said, don't you think I've done wonderful work on the home free? And I said, no, I think you've ruined it, because I liked it much better the first version. So we started off right at odds. Subsequently, that fall, one night I was wandering around the village and I ran into Lanford, also wandering around. It was a cold October night. And we went to Wayland's drugstore on the corner of 8th Street and 6th Avenue and had a cup of hot chocolate. And he said, oh, I've written this, my first full-length play. And I said, oh yeah, what's it called? And he said, Balm and Gilead. And I said, oh, well, I'd really like to read it sometime. And he said, what are you doing now? And I said, okay. So this is 2 o'clock in the morning. I followed him back to the Broadway Central Hotel, which later became a model for the Hot L Baltimore. And I sat up on Lanford's daybed and read from beginning to end Balm and Gilead, which had at that time about 57 characters in it. And at the end of it, I handed it back to him and said, you know, this is a contemporary lower depths. It's really extraordinary, but you're going to need a brilliant director to direct this, to bring it to life. So Lanford thought I hated it. And I read it to Michael Powell, a mutual friend, about a week later, and he said, why do you hate Balm and Gilead? I think it's so brilliant. And I said, I don't hate it. I said it was a lower depths. Of course, Lanford had no classical reference, so he didn't know what I was talking about. To say you're the contemporary Gorky is quite high praise. And I said, didn't he understand that when I was said that you need a brilliant director, I was talking about me? You know, I meant I'd like to direct it. So once that got cleared up, Michael went back to him and said, you know, Marshall says it's the best original play he's ever read. And he said this in front of Lanford and Clarice Nelson. And Lanford said, well, how many original plays has he read? And Clarice said, well, all of mine for a start. Eventually, I directed Balm and Gilead in January of 1965. It was the first full-length play produced off-off Broadway at the Caffe Cino, and we had lines around the block. It was really a great success.
I remember it very vividly. It was gigantic. How many actors did you have in that?
I think it was 37.
It was mind-boggling.
Yeah.
There's lots of simultaneous conversations, multiple plot lines, and I never got lost. I never was bored. Everyone I knew was in it.
Yes.
Anyone knew was in it.
It was an extraordinary experience, and for many, many years people would ask me, why don't you bring back Balm and Gilead? Why did you do it again? And it was such a special, remarkable experience. I was absolutely spooked by the thought of trying to recreate it, because, you know, lightning doesn't strike twice in exactly that same creative way. So many years later, of course, John Malkovich directed a production of it in Chicago, and I saw it there, and then I said, you know what, this will get everybody off my back. We can bring John's production to New York, and we did that with half Steppenwolf and half Circle Rep actors, and of course it was a big success here. Finally, everybody got to see it, but nobody, you know, I mean, it was a bittersweet for me to have Circle Rep have a great success with Balm and Gilead, but
you had introduced the play.
I had introduced the play, and you know, John's production was very alive and quite wonderful, but the difference between his production and mine was that mine was music.
Right.
You know, it was beautiful to hear as well as to watch.
It flowed.
Yeah.
Now we're skipping ahead with we seem to be going chronologically here, and we were off Broadway, and then after the death of Joe Cino, you co-founded
Circle Rep.
Circle
But
Rep.
before we get to that, shouldn't we talk about Haunted Host a little bit?
Oh yes, of course. We showed some pictures from Haunted Host. That was.
They already showed
They showed the pictures of
Okay.
Haunted Host.
Well, that young man that you saw then was William Hoffman, as a young. What were you? You weren't an actor.
No, I certainly wasn't.
You were an editor at Hill and Wang. And
I wasn't a writer either at that
you weren't a
time.
writer either, but Robert Patrick had written his first
See
play.
how writing ruined my looks? I tell you.
Robert Patrick wrote this wonderful play called The Haunted Host, and I knew Bill from the Caffe Cino, and I just thought that the author, Robert Patrick, and you would make the perfect match, and they were really quite extraordinarily good performances from both of you. And I feature them, a picture of it in my book. This book is about directing, by the way. It comes out September 28th, I'm sorry, August 28th, according to Amazon.com.
Of this year, 2006?
Yeah, 2006. So it will be available, I guess, this September. It's available.
That's very exciting.
And the book is about, it's called Creating Life on Stage, a Director's Approach to Working with Actors. And what excites me about it is it's the first time that I'm aware of that a directing book has really been written on this subject. Directors are usually about stage pictures and, so forth. What I talk about is how to get good performances from actors and what the whole rehearsal process is, designed to do. As you know, I work differently from almost anybody else. So finally, I've documented how I work, and I hope it will be a guide to other people to at least re-examine their work in terms of some of the principles of directing that I have. You mentioned the Moscow Art Theater, which of course is what we tried to create in a way with Circle Rep. That was our model. And Stanislavski, of course, has been, he created the first systematic approach to acting, first systematic approach to art, in fact. And there's never been a comparable book in terms of directing, and that's what I've tried to do with this, is to say, how do you take an actor that works in the artistic way, using Stanislavski and Sanford Meisner, how do you make the most of that kind of training as a director? Because most directors seem to have no idea about how actors work, and they just work in terms of the results. So I talk about the process of acting and how a director can really work with that to achieve a living production.
Well, I know I'm going to read it. I can't wait to get a copy of it. And how did you get from Off-Off Broadway to founding your own off-Broadway theater? What happened?
Well, we went to London in 1968.
Who's we?
Clarice Nelson, Charles Stanley from the Caffe Cino, Tanya Barrison, David Groh, and Michael Warren Powell. The five of us took the Queen Elizabeth I, oh God, to Great Britain, and we rehearsed on board actually because we had had an invitation from a small London theater up at Notting Hill Gate, because they had had a great success with the La Mama troupe that had just been there. And so we went back and they wanted another American play. I said, well, we can bring you one. So we called ourselves the American Theater Project. We went over to London, did Home Free and The Madness of Lady Bright, which were two plays of Lanford Wilson. And they were enormously successful. We had a review that said we were the best American theater. And here we weren't even American theater. We just called ourselves the American Theater Project to help get the working papers, because we thought it sounded pretty spiffy and they couldn't turn us down. Right. So after that, we came back to this country, and we had now a company of actors with reviews from London that loved us, but no theater. So as you will probably remember, I went to the guys at Lincoln Center, who were running Lincoln Center at that time, and they had a downstairs space that was really quite wonderful. I think, what's it called now?
Mitzi Newhouse. The
Mitzi Newhouse, it's called now. And it was empty. No, they weren't using it at all. They were only using the theater upstairs. And I said, you've got a theater with no company. I've got a company with no theater. How about we get together? And Jules Irving said, great idea. And so we went into rehearsal on a new play called Spring Play by one William Hoffman. And it was an extraordinary experience. But we rehearsed for Lincoln Center because we were going to be in this wonderful little
Right.
intimate, only 8 seats deep, 8 rows deep kind of theater. And they gave us the rehearsal space and everything. And then Actors Equity stepped in at the last moment and said, you cannot perform here, because they were in the middle of contract negotiations with Lincoln Center. So we got squeezed between 2 giants, and as a result, we had to move theaters. Equity found us a theater, but the theater they found us was 26 rows deep, and we'd rehearsed for 8 rows. So from the back of the house, you couldn't hear anything. And it was, as you probably remember, an absolute nightmare.
Catastrophe.
A catastrophe. And I said, okay, that's it, I'm out of theater, I'm not going to do any more. I was really fed up. And then
You
I
were
got
fed up. I was fed
Huh?
up too. I was fed up too.
Yeah, I'm sure. It was a disaster. But you know, great things often are when they miss. You miss greatly. You miss enormously. And it is a catastrophe. It's better to have a catastrophe than it is to have a near miss, you know, I think.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
So later that year, about 6 months later, I was having dinner with Rob Thurkield and Tanya Barrison, and Lanford was also invited, and the 4 of us were getting ready to eat dinner, and we had a call from a fellow that we knew, Dr. Harry Lerner, who said, I've got this wonderful place on the Upper West Side that's for rent. You want to come look at it? So Lanford and Rob and I jumped into a taxi, left Tanya cooking, and the 3 of us went uptown to 83rd and Broadway on the 2nd floor above a Tom McCann shoe store. It was this big blue room that had been, I guess, a lodge of some kind. It was painted in very, very dark blue. I don't know what you call it. It's got a name, but I can't think of what the name is at the moment. Anyway, and a tiny little stage, and I said, oh, no, this isn't what we want for a theater at all. And Dr. Lerner said, well, if you're not going to take it, I'm going to take it. And I said, okay, well, if you're going to take it, we'll come use it, you know, for a while. So we did that, and we had a big party on Bastille Day, July the 14th, and we invited everybody that we knew who we respected in the theater, actors and directors and writers, to come to this party, at which Rob and I stood up and announced in the middle of the party that we were going to start a repertory company.
Hold that thought.
Yeah.
Because we have to end our first part here, and we will start with that on the second part.
Okay.
Thank you. It has been a great pleasure to speak with you today, Marshall, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about the rest of your rich career. Thank you, Marshall W. Mason, and we'll see you next time.